palace slept differently than the city outside its gates. Beyond the walls, Dubai's avenues glowed with restless light, cars whispering like silver fish across the midnight boulevards. But inside the palace, silence reigned, a silence carved from marble and guarded by centuries of tradition. The fountains in the inner courtyard murmured only to themselves, and the lanterns, jeweled with colored glass, breathed a faint glow over the empty majlis. Farid moved like a shadow across those polished halls, his white thobe faintly dusted from the day's work in the gardens. To most who crossed his path, he was invisible, an attendant, a servant whose presence was as ordinary as the rugs beneath their feet. His calloused hands carried buckets, brushes, and trays. No one noticed that sometimes, in the quietest hours, those same hands lingered too long on the lid of a piano that rested forgotten in a corner of the East Salon. The instrument was a rare Steinway, imported decades ago as a gesture of cultural prestige. Most nights it was covered with a cloth embroidered in gold thread, more ornament than voice. Yet to Farid, it was no decoration. It was a relic, a sleeping companion, a secret doorway into a life he had once lived and lost. When the palace emptied of guests and the last echoes of conversation faded, he would pause at the piano, brush away the thin film of dust, and let his fingers hover above the ivory keys. He rarely pressed them, afraid that even a whisper of melody might betray him to the guards or to fate itself. But the weight of memory always gathered there, pressing against his chest like the heat of the desert sun. Once, long ago, these hands had belonged not to a servant, but to a prodigy. Once, they had commanded respect in halls far colder, where European chandeliers trembled to Chopin and Liszt. But grief is a thief that robs not only people, but also futures. A car crash had taken his mother, his scholarship, and the piano that was his only home. What remained was silence, years of it, until he found himself here, reduced to polishing marble tiles, while the world forgot his name. Yet the piano did not forget. Each time his hand lingered over it, he felt as though the instrument was waiting. He thought himself unseen, but palaces have eyes sharper than falcons. That evening, Sheikha Yasmin entered the salon unannounced. The daughter of Sheikh Rashid Al Nahyan, she carried herself with the poise of one accustomed to obedience. Draped in an abaya of deep emerald embroidered with threads of gold, she moved as if the marble floor itself had been laid to echo her presence. Known throughout the Emirates for her leadership in cultural foundations and for her unforgiving wit, Yasmin was admired, feared, and envied in equal measure. She paused when she noticed him near the piano. For a heartbeat, her brow arched in curiosity. Then her lips curved into a smile sharp enough to cut silk. She asked, her voice low, each word falling like a coin into still water. Farid straightened, bowing his head with the reflex of one accustomed to hierarchy. "It is Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Your Highness," he replied softly. His voice carried no tremor, but his heart thundered like hooves across the desert. For a moment she seemed surprised, then amused. A laugh escaped her, not cruel in sound, but heavy with disbelief. The words were tossed carelessly, as though they were meant to vanish into the marble like smoke. A challenge, not a promise. A jest that underlined the abyss between them. But Farid's eyes did not waver. They were dark, steady pools, carrying the weight of years she could not imagine. He did not answer aloud, yet something in his silence unsettled her more than protest would have. She turned, the silk of her abaya whispering against the air, and walked away before the moment could lengthen into meaning. What she did not realize was that her careless words had pierced the armor of his resignation. They had cracked open a sealed door in his chest, letting through a sliver of light. That night, Farid lay awake in the servants' quarters, staring at the carved ceiling above his narrow bed. Her voice returned to him again and again. "If you can actually play, if you dare." He had not touched a piano properly in years. His hands had grown stiff, his muscles bound by labor. Yet deep inside, the memory of music stirred. He remembered the way notes once poured through him like water over stone, carrying grief and joy together. He remembered the applause, the gaze of his mother in the front row, the dream of stages yet to come. Now, in the heart of an Arabian palace, he wondered if the desert itself was daring him to rise. The next dawn, before the first call to prayer painted the horizon with its sacred music, Farid slipped quietly into the east salon. The Steinway stood waiting, still cloaked in its golden cover. He pulled it back, revealing black wood polished like obsidian, keys glimmering pale as moonlight. He placed his hands upon them. At first his fingers stumbled. Years of silence had stiffened them. The sound was uneven, brittle. He closed his eyes, inhaled the faint scent of oud incense still lingering from the previous evening, and tried again. This time the music came. Not perfect, not effortless, but alive. A thread pulled from memory, fragile yet unbroken. Each note was a step back into the self he had abandoned. Each chord, a breath stolen from despair. The sound echoed across the salon, filling its arches like a prayer too long unsaid. And though no one was there to listen, the palace itself seemed to pause. Farid's journey had begun. The days that followed carried the stillness of sand dunes, unchanging to the eye, yet shifting silently beneath the surface. Farid rose before dawn, long before the call to prayer echoed through the minarets of Dubai, and stole into the east salon, where the piano waited like a sleeping falcon. The marble floor was cool beneath his sandals, the lanterns dim, their colored glass casting rubies and sapphires against the pale walls. At first, his hands betrayed him. The years of sweeping stone and carrying buckets had stiffened his joints, calloused his fingertips. Notes faltered, stumbling out like a man who has forgotten his language. He pressed too hard, then too soft, each mistake echoing louder in the emptiness of the salon. Sweat gathered at his temples, though the air was cool. But Farid did not surrender. Every morning, he returned. His fingers remembered more than he thought. They were like seeds buried deep in desert soil, dormant until rain arrived. Slowly, haltingly, the music emerged. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, fragmented at first, then flowing, then breaking again. He played until the first streak of sunlight crossed the patterned lattice of the window. Only then would he rise, cover the piano with its golden cloth, and slip back into the rhythm of servitude before the palace stirred awake. During the day, he worked silently among the staff. He polished the fountains, tended the inner gardens, scrubbed marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers. His hands obeyed duty, but his heart carried the secret of music, growing louder with each dawn rehearsal. When the palace filled with courtiers and visiting dignitaries, he kept his eyes lowered, yet in his chest melodies twined like vines reclaiming abandoned stone. At night, when the staff quarters lay in shadow and snores rose through the narrow halls, Farid returned again. The corridors were quiet, but the palace itself seemed to listen. He lit no lantern. Moonlight through the mashrabia screens was enough. The keys gleamed pale beneath his fingers as though they too remembered the boy who once belonged to them. Some nights he faltered, breaking down with his forehead pressed to the cool wood of the piano. He saw again his mother's smile the last time she had heard him play, a smile stolen by fate and asphalt. He heard again the silence of the hospital room, the absence of her hands clapping, the finality of doors closing. On those nights, the notes blurred with tears. But grief, too, is a teacher. He learned to play through it, not against it. Each tear polished a note until it shone clearer. The palace had a rhythm of its own, and soon whispers reached even the staff. A gala was being prepared, a night of charity, organized under the patronage of Sheikha Yasmin herself. The East Salon, usually a chamber of quiet, would become a stage for the Emirate's most celebrated guests. Courtiers spoke of jewels being commissioned, gowns arriving from Beirut, perfumes distilled specially for the evening. The great Steinway would be placed in the center, though no pianist had yet been named. A trio of musicians from Cairo had been expected, but rumors of their delay drifted like smoke. When Farid heard the whispers, his heart clenched. Was this the door fate had opened with Yasmin's careless challenge? He did not dare believe it, yet he practiced harder, longer. His fingers no longer stumbled as before. The music flowed, halting less with each night. The nocturne stretched its wings once more, haunting the arches with sorrow and light. One morning, as he lingered too long over a final chord, a shaft of sunlight struck the piano, flooding the salon with gold. He froze, as though the desert itself had caught him. In that moment, he whispered to himself, "Inshallah, if destiny willed it, he would play." The week of the gala arrived. The palace transformed. Lanterns of colored glass were polished until they blazed like captured stars. Long carpets were unfurled across marble, their reds and creams glowing beneath the chandeliers. Servants hurried with trays of silver, and the air grew rich with the scent of rosewater, cardamom, and oud. Farid bent to his work as always, but each gesture was a mask. Beneath the rhythm of labor, his pulse counted down the hours. On the final night before the gala, he sat at the piano once more. His fingers pressed the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne, and for the first time in years, they did not falter. The music rose smooth and whole, weaving sorrow with tenderness, loss with defiance. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, and in the silence that followed, he knew, when the moment came, he would no longer play for himself. He would play for his mother, for the years stolen, for the dignity hidden beneath a servant's thobe. He would play for every unseen soul in the palace. Outside, the desert wind stirred, rattling palm fronds in the courtyard. The moon rose like a silver coin over the domes. The hour was coming. The night of the gala arrived with the splendor of a desert storm made not of sand, but of silk, perfume, and light. The palace's eastern wings blazed with lanterns of colored glass, casting sapphires and emeralds upon the marble floors. Golden candelabra rose like trees of fire. Their flames mirrored 100-fold in polished brass trays and crystal goblets. From the courtyards came the murmur of fountains perfumed with rosewater, their streams catching the starlight as if scattering jewels into the air. Guests began to arrive in a procession of black limousines gliding through the palace gates. Men in flowing white thobes and dark bishts embroidered with gold stepped onto carpets woven in crimson and cream. Women in gowns of silk and abayas threaded with silver moved like constellations across the marble steps. Their laughter carried on the night air, alongside the scent of jasmine and oud. The palace, usually a citadel of silence, breathed with the rhythm of expectation. In the grand salon, servants hurried in measured choreography. Silver trays bore dates stuffed with almonds, pistachio sweets dusted green, and porcelain cups waiting for Arabic coffee. The musicians had been expected from Cairo, but word spread like smoke among the staff. Their arrival was delayed. Whispers curled between attendants, but no solution was announced. The Steinway stood unveiled in the center of the hall, a black mirror beneath the chandeliers, waiting like a question that had not yet found its answer. Farid moved among the shadows of duty, carrying linens, adjusting lanterns, setting cushions in perfect symmetry. His eyes remained lowered, but his heart beat against his ribs, like a falcon straining at its hood. He knew what the absence of musicians meant. He knew what the piano was demanding. Each step he took was heavy with the thought, this could be the night. Sheikha Yasmin entered last among the royal hosts, her presence a command that bent the room. She wore a gown of ivory silk beneath a cloak of emerald, a cascade of pearls at her throat that gleamed like captured moons. Her eyes, sharp as a desert hawk, swept the salon. Applause rose for her arrival, and she acknowledged it with the faintest curve of her lips, a smile polished into authority. When her gaze brushed the piano, she arched a brow as though mocking the very idea of its silence. Farid caught the glance, though he dared not meet it fully. He remembered her words, thrown at him like a jest, careless as sand scattered by wind. If you can actually play Chopin, I will marry you. He had carried them like an ember, and tonight the ember threatened to blaze. The gala unfolded in opulence. Courtiers traded compliments sharp as daggers wrapped in silk. Diplomats raised glasses of pomegranate juice, their laughter echoing beneath the chandeliers. Poets recited verses in corners, and oud players strummed melodies that drifted like incense through the arches. Yet the piano remained untouched, a silent sentinel in the midst of celebration. At one point, a guest approached Yasmin, gesturing toward the Steinway. Yasmin's smile was cool, her tone light, but her words carried the edge of challenge. The room laughed politely. Farid's hands, hidden behind a tray, tightened until his knuckles ached. As the evening deepened, the music faltered. The oud players withdrew, and silence threatened to spill across the hall. Guests shifted, restless. The piano gleamed in the center, commanding attention by absence. The palace air thickened, heavy with expectation unmet. It was then that Farid felt the pull of destiny as strongly as the tide pulls the moonlit shore. He set down the tray he carried, his breath slow, but his pulse aflame. One step, then another, across the marble floor. At first no one noticed. To them, He was only a servant moving furniture, another shadow among many. But when he stopped before the Steinway and removed the golden cover from its keys, a ripple moved through the room. Conversations broke. Glasses paused mid-air. Farid lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling only in memory, not in will. For a heartbeat, he closed his eyes. He saw his mother's face. He felt the silence of the years. Then he drew a breath as deep as the desert night and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's nocturne rose like water from a hidden spring, delicate, haunting, alive. The sound filled the salon, brushing against the mosaics, climbing the arches, silencing even the fountains beyond the walls. Guests turned, astonished, some gasping, others frozen, as if they had stepped into a dream. At the far end of the hall, Yasmin's eyes widened. Her lips parted, not with laughter this time, but with awe she could not mask. The servant she had mocked was commanding the room with nothing but his hands and his heart. The music carried sorrow, love, and dignity woven together. Each note was a confession, each pause a memory. Some guests wept without knowing why. Others bowed their heads as though in prayer. The palace, which had seen centuries of power and intrigue, now bore witness to something older and purer, the truth of a soul laid bare. Farid did not look at Yasmin. He did not look at anyone. His gaze stayed with the keys, with the path his mother had set before him long ago. He played as though every loss, every silence, every humiliation had been waiting for this moment to transform into sound. And when the final note lingered like a crescent moon hanging alone in the sky, silence fell heavier than stone. No one dared move. The room itself seemed to bow. Farid rose, bowed his head slightly, not to the sheikha, not to the guests, but to the music itself, and turned to leave. The storm he had unleashed was only beginning. For a long moment after the final chord dissolved, the salon did not breathe. The last vibration of the Steinway lingered in the arches, as though the palace itself was reluctant to release it. The chandeliers shimmered as if trembling, and even the fountains in the courtyard seemed to hush their song. Farid remained seated, his head bowed slightly, hands resting on the ivory keys. He felt the silence like a mantle, heavier than any applause. For him, the music was not performance, but confession, and confessions do not demand clapping. They demand listening. Then slowly the room exhaled. A murmur spread through the guests. Some covered their mouths with jeweled hands. Others blinked away tears they did not want to acknowledge. Farid stood. He did not bow to the sheikha, nor to the guests, but only to the piano, his old companion reclaimed. He turned to step away, intending to vanish once more into the anonymity of service. But the hall was no longer willing to let him disappear. A voice broke the silence. It was trembling, though proud. Asked a guest. Another answered, "A servant," but the words rang false, hollow, against what they had just witnessed. No one who had heard that music could call him nothing. At the dais, Sheikha Yasmin's gaze had frozen. Her lips, painted in the faintest shade of rose, parted slightly, but no words emerged. Her emerald cloak shimmered as she shifted, as though the ground itself had become unsteady beneath her. The mockery she had once thrown now returned to her as judgment, reflected in the silent astonishment of her guests. Her mind reached for armor, but none came. The man she had dismissed was now the center of her court, and she could not deny it. In his playing, she had heard dignity deeper than wealth, sorrow purer than diamonds, a strength more commanding than crowns. For the first time in years, Yasmin felt stripped of control, reduced to silence by a truth she could neither own nor dismiss. Farid walked steadily toward the edge of the hall. Each step echoed as though marking the rhythm of a procession. Servants and courtiers moved aside instinctively, some lowering their eyes not in disdain, but in reverence. In that moment, his thobe of simple cotton seemed more regal than any embroidered bisht in the room. Whispers chased him. Who taught him? How did we not know? What will the sheikha do? Yasmin remained seated, her back straight, but her breath uneven. Inside her chest, something unfamiliar coiled. Not anger, not scorn, but shame. Shame that she, with all her pearls and authority, had failed to recognize the diamond hidden in dust. As Farid reached the doors of the salon, the silence broke at last. A single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant, almost fearful. Then another joined, and another. until the chamber filled with applause like a wave cresting against the shore. The ovation rolled over him, relentless, rising higher with every heartbeat. But Farid did not turn back. He placed his hand on the door, bowed his head once more, and stepped out into the corridor. The applause thundered behind him. Yet in the quiet of the hallway, he heard only his mother's voice, gentle as the desert wind. "You were always meant for more, my son." Inside the salon, Yasmin remained motionless, her fingers gripping the armrest of her gilded chair. Around her, guests whispered of miracles, of destiny, of a servant who played like a prophet of sound. And though her face stayed composed, her heart was a storm. For the first time in her reign as the untouchable Sheikha, Yasmin felt a power greater than her own, a power that had emerged not from lineage, wealth, or decree, but from truth. The music had changed the palace, and it had changed her. The applause faded into memory, but its echo clung to the marble walls long after Farid vanished into the shadowed corridors. The great salon of the palace had been reshaped in a single evening. A gathering meant to display wealth and authority had been hijacked by the voice of truth carried on piano keys. Guests lingered in clusters, their jeweled fingers gesturing, their voices weaving rumors that fluttered like restless birds. Murmured one ambassador. "Some hidden prodigy, surely," replied a courtier. "But we have all seen him scrubbing floors," another whispered, shaking her head. "A miracle." The word scandal spread quickly, as though it had been waiting for a chance to escape. At the dais, Sheikha Yasmin remained still, her eyes fixed upon the Steinway that still quivered faintly from Farid's touch. She felt her authority fraying, her carefully built image threatened not by a rival of wealth or politics, but by a servant's music. And yet, beneath the sting of humiliation, a current of awe stirred, undeniable, unsettling. She had mocked him, yes, but he had answered with beauty so undeniable, it rebuked her in front of her own court. Her closest advisor, a stern woman in a black abaya, leaned toward her. Yasmin's fingers tightened around the carved armrest of her chair. The instinct to erase the source of discomfort surged within her, yet something in her heart resisted. To dismiss him now would be to admit fear. Worse, it would be to silence the only thing that had moved her in years. "No," she said at last, her voice steady though her chest betrayed her with a racing heart. "Let him remain." The advisor bowed, masking surprise, and stepped back. Later that night, when the guests had departed in a flurry of perfumes and goodbyes, Yasmin remained in the salon. The Steinway stood alone in the center, its black surface reflecting the golden chandeliers now dimmed to embers. She approached it slowly, her steps echoing across the marble. Her fingers brushed the keys, tentative, as though the instrument might still be warm from Farid's touch. She pressed one note, soft, hesitant. The sound rang hollow, empty. She closed the lid with a snap, her breath sharp. Why him, she thought. Why not one of the trained musicians I have patronized, the maestros who bow before me? Why did the heavens choose a servant to humiliate me? But another thought followed, quieter, sharper. Or was it not humiliation at all? Was it revelation? Farid, meanwhile, walked alone through the servants' corridors. The echoes of applause still roared in his ears, but he forced them aside. Applause was dangerous. It tempted pride, and pride could destroy a man faster than silence. He reached the small chamber where he slept, its ceiling low, its bed narrow. Sitting on the edge, he pressed his face into his hands. His body trembled, not from fear, but from release. Years of silence had cracked open, and in their place music had returned, flooding through him like the first rains after drought. He whispered into the stillness, "Mother, did you hear me? Tonight, I played for you." The following day, the palace buzzed with whispers. Servants carried trays with more urgency, their eyes flicking toward Farid as though he had grown two faces. Some looked at him with awe, others with resentment. "He will not last," muttered one. But when Yasmin entered the majlis that afternoon, she did not look away from him. For the first time, her gaze met his directly. The weight of emerald and authority still cloaked her, but something had shifted. "You," she said, her voice like glass cutting through air. The servants froze, eyes darting. "Come to the east salon." Farid bowed, his heart steady. He followed her, each step measured, each breath a prayer. The salon was empty, sunlight pouring through the lattice windows, painting the marble with gold patterns. Yasmin stood beside the piano, her hands clasped before her. "You made me a fool last night," she began, her tone sharp. Farid lowered his head, her eyes narrowed. "Do you expect me to believe that? You stole the gaze of every guest in this palace. They speak of you, not me. And yet," she paused, the words catching like silk on thorns. Farid lifted his eyes at last, steady, respectful. "It was never meant to silence you, Sheikha." The room seemed to hold its breath. Yasmin's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a sensation she had not felt in years. Humility. She turned sharply, her cloak sweeping behind her. "You will play again," she commanded, though her voice carried less steel than before. "Not for them, for me." And without waiting for reply, she left the salon, her emerald figure dissolving into the corridors of marble and light. Farid remained by the piano, his pulse steady. He had been summoned not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a musician. The desert winds outside whispered through the palms like an omen. Tomorrow, the true test would begin. The following evening descended with the solemnity of a ritual. The palace's great halls bustled with preparations for another night of grandeur. But in the east salon, silence ruled. The golden lanterns glowed faintly, their jeweled glass softening the dusk into pools of amber and emerald. Incense of oud drifted through the air, its fragrance clinging to the carved arches like memory. Farid stood before the Steinway, his thobe plain, his hands freshly washed, as though he were approaching prayer. This was no gala, no audience of glittering jewels and whispers. Only one pair of eyes awaited him now, eyes sharp as falcons, and yet, perhaps, as uncertain as his own. Sheikha Yasmin entered without fanfare. Her steps echoed across the marble floor, the hem of her cloak brushing against the tiles like a tide. Tonight she wore no pearls, no dazzling silks, only a dark abaya threaded with faint silver, as if the night sky itself had wrapped around her. For the first time, she appeared not as the sovereign of the palace, but as a woman stripped to her own presence. She stopped a few paces from the piano, folding her hands before her. "Play," she said simply. Farid bowed his head, lowered himself to the bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes rose softly, not the grandeur of the nocturne that had silenced a court, but a gentler melody, an improvisation born of memory. The sound carried like moonlight spilled across desert sands, fragile, intimate, impossibly clear. Yasmin's breath caught. She had expected defiance, perhaps triumph, but not this tenderness that seemed to unravel the edges of her armor. Each note was like a thread tugging at the walls she had built around herself. Farid did not look at her, but his music spoke as if he knew her heart. It told of loneliness hidden in crowded rooms, of burdens carried behind jeweled veils, of power that isolates even as it dazzles. Yasmin felt as though he had stripped her soul bare without a single word. She turned away, her eyes burning, unwilling to let him see her falter. Yet the music pursued her, filling the corners of the salon, refusing to let her retreat. At last, the piece ended. Silence returned, heavier than before. Yasmin spoke first, her voice low, uncertain. Farid lifted his gaze, calm and steady. "I do nothing, Sheikha. The music does." Her lips parted, but no reply came. She wanted to dismiss him, to reassert control, yet her heart rebelled against her tongue. She felt something unfamiliar, respect. Not the respect given to a servant who obeys, but the respect owed to an equal. She stepped closer, her cloak whispering against the marble. For a moment, her hand hovered above the piano, then fell away, as though afraid of trespassing upon its truth. "You will play again," she said, her tone softer now, less command than request. "Tomorrow." Farid bowed once more, but as she turned to leave, Yasmin paused. The words trembled in her throat, dangerous, foreign. Then she was gone, leaving the scent of oud and the echo of her confession behind. Farid sat in the fading light, his heart steady yet heavy. He had touched something within her tonight, something deeper than pride or scorn. He sensed that the path ahead was no longer about music alone. It was about truth, and truth was always perilous in palaces. The days that followed unfolded like the verses of a hidden poem, each evening returning Farid to the East Salon, each dusk drawing Sheikha Yasmin back to the same place as though fate itself commanded it. The palace still moved in its glittering rhythms, banquets, councils, diplomatic audiences. But somewhere within its walls, away from the eyes of courtiers, a secret dialogue was taking shape. Yasmin never asked for familiar pieces. She demanded no Chopin, no Beethoven, no names to frame the music. She would simply say, "Play," and Farid would obey. What emerged each night was not recital, but revelation, melodies born in the moment, shaped by memory and silence. Sometimes the music was sorrowful, heavy as desert dusk. Sometimes it was tender, as if woven from starlight and rosewater. Each time, Yasmin felt as though he reached into her heart and spoke aloud the truths she had never dared confess. She began to linger after the final note, watching him with a gaze less sharp than before. At first, her words were guarded, clipped. "You carry discipline in your fingers," she said one night. Farid would bow his head, answering softly, "Armor has its place." Her lips curved faintly at that, though she quickly concealed it. Yet the change did not go unnoticed. Among the servants, whispers spread like wildfire. The sheikha who once regarded her staff as invisible now summoned one among them nightly. Rumors twisted into stories. Some said he had bewitched her with music. Others whispered of forbidden intimacy. The palace, built of stone and silence, became a hive of speculation. Farid bore the whispers with calm, though in solitude they pressed upon him. He knew the danger of proximity to power. To be noticed by Yasmin was to risk everything: exile, disgrace, even death. Yet each night when her voice summoned him, he obeyed, not from ambition, but because the music demanded it. For Yasmin, the nights became an escape from the weight of rule. She, who had been sculpted into marble by expectation, began to rediscover the pulse of flesh beneath her skin. She found herself confessing fragments of truth between songs. "My father never asked what I wanted," she said one evening, her eyes fixed on the fountain visible through the lattice. Farid played in answer, his chords carrying the sound of desert winds racing over dunes, loneliness vast, yet beautiful. Yasmin closed her eyes, allowing herself for the first time to feel the ache she had buried. "Another night," she whispered. "They bow to me, but they do not see me." Farid's reply was gentle, but steady. "Existence does not require permission, Sheikha." Her breath caught, and she turned her face away lest he see the tremor in her expression. Still, the palace outside their chamber grew restless. Advisors noticed her absence from certain gatherings, her distraction in councils. But Yasmin did not forget. If anything, she was awakening. The Sheikha who once ruled with steel felt something stirring that frightened her more than rebellion: desire. Not for power, but for truth, for connection, for the man who played as if each note were a prayer. Farid, for his part, remained careful. He never crossed the boundary of respect. When she asked him questions, he answered with humility. When her eyes lingered, he lowered his gaze. Yet inside him, too, a quiet storm was forming. Each time she sat in silence listening, her face softened not by pearls but by vulnerability. He felt the weight of what was forbidden. By the end of the week, Yasmin's voice, once sharp as steel, had softened into something dangerous: trust. "Tomorrow," she said one night, as she lingered by the piano, "you will not play for me alone. I will bring another to hear you." Her tone gave nothing away, but her eyes burned with conflict. Farid bowed, his chest tightening. He knew this was no longer only about music. It was about fate pressing upon them both, testing the fragile bond they had dared to weave in the shadows of tradition. The desert winds outside rose, rattling the lattice screens like a warning. Tomorrow, another would bear witness, and nothing would remain hidden. The next evening descended with a weight that even the air seemed to carry. The palace glowed as always, lanterns of amber light, the scent of cardamom and oud, fountains whispering in courtyards. But beneath the beauty, tension curled like a coiled serpent. Farid felt it the moment Yasmin summoned him. Her voice was steady, yet something sharper hid within it, like steel beneath silk. He entered the east salon to find her already waiting, not alone as before. At her side stood a man draped in a black bisht trimmed with gold, his bearing regal, his gaze cold and appraising. His beard was neatly trimmed, his keffiyeh held in place by a golden agal. His presence filled the room with authority, even before Yasmin spoke his name. "This is my uncle, Sheikh Tariq," she said, her voice clipped. "He has guided the affairs of our family for decades. Farid bowed low, pressing his hands together. Tariq did not bow in return. His eyes lingered on Farid, the way a hawk studies prey. "So this is the servant who dares steal the court's whispers," he said. Yasmin gestured toward the piano. Farid sat, his breath steady, though his pulse thundered. He laid his fingers on the keys and began, not with the grandeur of Chopin, nor with the tender improvisations he had given Yasmin in private, but with something new, a melody of strength and sorrow entwined, like the desert wind that can both carve stone and cradle a falcon's wing. The notes filled the salon, climbing the arches, brushing against the mosaics with their invisible touch. Tariq's eyes narrowed, his arms folded. He listened without moving, without blinking, as though the music were a test he intended to crush. Yasmin, by contrast, stood at the edge of the piano, her hands clasped tightly. Though she had summoned Tariq to hear, part of her feared what his verdict might be. She could not deny the power of Farid's music, but she knew too well the ruthlessness of her uncle's counsel. The piece ended in a chord that lingered like a prayer unanswered. Silence followed, thick as desert night. Tariq did not applaud. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Farid. "You have skill," he admitted, though the words were begrudging. "But skill does not change truth. You are a servant." Farid bowed his head. Tariq's lips curved faintly, not in kindness, but in warning. "Be careful, boy." He turned to Yasmin, his eyes hard. "Niece, do not let your heart be led astray by illusions. A servant who plays like a prince is still a servant." Yasmin's chest tightened, but she lifted her chin. Tariq's gaze darkened. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended. When Tariq left, the tension remained. Yasmin lingered by the piano, her cloak whispering against the marble as she turned toward Farid. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes burned. "You played bravely tonight," she said, "and in doing so, you have placed yourself in danger." Farid met her gaze, steady, unflinching. For the first time, Yasmin allowed herself a smile. Small, fleeting, but real. Outside, the desert wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of storm. In the days that followed Sheikh Tariq's visit, the palace became a cage of whispers. What had once been harmless curiosity about the servant who could play had transformed into sharper tones. Accusations murmured in corners, suspicions passed behind veils. "He plays for her every night," said one advisor. "Too much intimacy for a sheikha and a servant," another muttered. "What if he seeks influence?" Yasmin heard these whispers. They circled her like falcons, hungry for weakness. She maintained her poise in the council chambers, her words sharp, her authority unshaken. Yet inside, her heart beat with conflict. She could not silence the music she had heard, nor deny the humanity it had awakened within her. Each night she summoned Farid still, though she disguised her summons as trivial errands. To the court he was polishing brass or tending to fountains. To her, he was bringing her back to life. One evening, as the last light bled over the desert horizon, she entered the east salon to find him already seated at the piano, his fingers resting gently on the keys, as though he had been waiting not for her command, but for her presence. "You should not be here tonight," Yasmin said, though her tone lacked conviction. Farid looked up, his gaze calm. She hesitated, then sank onto a low seat near the fountain. The water rippled, casting shards of silver light across her face. "Truth," she repeated, her voice bitter. "Do you know what truth has cost me? Every truth I ever confessed was taken and used against me." Farid pressed a chord, soft, resonant. The music that followed was unlike any he had played before. It was neither sorrowful nor triumphant, but something in between, a balance. A fragile line walked in darkness. Yasmin listened, her breath slowing, her heart aching. In the melody, she heard her own contradictions. Pride and doubt, power and loneliness, steel and fragility. Farid shook his head. "No, Sheikha, music does not make us weak." For the first time, she allowed silence to stretch between them without filling it with command. She studied him. The plain thobe, the steady eyes, the dignity that no crown could grant. Something dangerous stirred within her, something more perilous than admiration. Later that night, she stood before her mirror, the pearls at her throat cold against her skin. She heard Tariq's warning in her memory. A servant is still a servant. But she also heard Farid's music, notes that had woven themselves into her very breath. Which was stronger, blood or truth? The court pressed harder. Proposals for her marriage were placed before her. Alliances with emirs and princes from Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi. Tariq pushed them relentlessly. "Your time is passing, niece," he warned. "The family must be secured." But Yasmin's eyes burned with defiance. For the first time, she did not see her future bound to duty alone. She saw it mirrored in the hands of a man forbidden to her by every law of tradition, and yet destined perhaps by something greater. The storm was gathering. She felt it in the restless winds that howled through the courtyard that night, rattling the palm fronds like drums. And deep inside, she knew the moment was approaching when silence would no longer protect them. The storm that had whispered in shadows now broke into thunder. Days after the last council, Yasmin entered the great hall to find it already assembled. Courtiers in embroidered robes, ministers with scrolls in their hands, elders from allied tribes. At the center, seated with the authority of a patriarch, was Sheikh Tariq. His eyes gleamed like obsidian polished by power. Yasmin froze at the threshold. She had not been told of this meeting. Her pulse quickened as her gaze swept across the gathering. At Tariq's right stood Emir Khalid, heir to a wealthy trade dynasty. He was tall, broad-shouldered, draped in silks of sapphire and gold. His expression carried confidence, even arrogance, as though the outcome had already been decided. Tariq rose. "Niece, the time has come. The house cannot wait forever for your whims." The hall erupted in polite applause. Yasmin's heart slammed against her ribs. Marriage, decreed in front of the court, her choice erased before it had even been voiced. Her lips curved into a controlled smile, but her eyes burned. She asked, her voice sharp enough to slice the air. Tariq's smile was a blade sheathed in silk. "Consultation is not required when destiny speaks. You are Sheikha, yes, but you are also daughter of this bloodline." Murmurs rippled across the room. Khalid bowed with a flourish, his arrogance masked as courtesy. "It would be my honor, Sheikha." Inside her, fury and despair collided. Images flashed in her mind. The music that had stripped her armor. The servant who had dared speak truth with his hands. The nights in the East Salon, where she had felt alive for the first time in years. Could she bury all of that beneath duty? Could she erase the sound of Farid's piano with the clang of chains forged by tradition? She lifted her chin, her voice steady though her heart trembled. Tariq's eyes narrowed. He had expected surrender, not defiance. "Consider quickly, niece." That night, Yasmin did not summon Farid. The East Salon lay in silence, the piano untouched. Farid, sensing the change, lingered in the servants' quarters, restless. He had heard the rumors of a suitor, of a marriage soon to be announced. His chest tightened, but he remained still. To seek her would be folly. To run would be cowardice. He chose instead to wait, trusting that music, like truth, could not be silenced forever. Yasmin, alone in her chamber, stood before the lattice window. The desert wind howled, carrying grains of sand that struck the glass like tiny knives. Her reflection stared back at her, cloaked in emerald and pearls, but she no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the ache there. In her silence, she whispered a name she dared not speak aloud, Farid, and the storm outside answered with a roar. The following days were a theater of masks. Yasmin attended councils, received ambassadors, and appeared in public with Khalid at her side, as though the marriage were already inevitable. Her smile was flawless, her voice commanding, her every gesture a portrait of regal composure. Yet inside, her heart raged like the desert storm that had battered her windows that night. Khalid, drunk on his own certainty, began to speak as though he were already her husband. "When we unite," he told courtiers, "the house will flourish beyond measure." His words made Yasmin's stomach tighten, but she concealed it with the grace of a queen who has worn masks since childhood. Behind closed doors, however, she suffocated. The emerald cloak felt like chains, the pearls at her throat like shackles. The memory of Farid's music haunted her like an echo that would not fade. Each note he had played seemed now a rebellion within her veins. She longed for the East Salon, for the unguarded nights when truth flowed freely, for the one man who had seen her not as Sheikha, not as prize, but as human. At last, one evening, she could bear it no longer. She dismissed her attendants and slipped into the corridors alone. her steps swift but silent. The palace slept around her, courtiers in their chambers, guards drowsy at their posts. She moved like a shadow until she reached the east salon. The doors opened with a sigh. Inside, the lanterns were unlit, but moonlight streamed through the lattice, silvering the piano in ghostly glow. And there he was, Farid, seated at the instrument, as though he too had been waiting. He rose instantly, bowing low. Her breath caught at the sight of him, plain as ever in his cotton thobe, yet more regal in that moment than Khalid could ever be in gold. She asked, her voice breaking its own command. He met her gaze calmly, because silence cannot hold me anymore. For the first time, Yasmin faltered. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She moved closer, her cloak trailing like night itself. "They will bind me to him," she whispered. "They will force me into chains of silk and duty. And I—" Her voice cracked. Farid's voice was steady, gentle, but unyielding. "Strength is not always in defiance, Sheikha. Sometimes it is in truth. You already carry it. You felt it in the music." She sank onto the seat beside the piano, her hand trembling as she touched its cool surface. "When you play," she said, her tone low, confessional, "I remember that I am alive." Farid's fingers brushed the keys, summoning a quiet melody, soft, fragile, like a heartbeat in the silence. He did not look at her, but his voice carried the weight of a vow. Her heart clenched. She turned to him, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "If they discover this, if Tariq learns what I feel—" Farid stopped playing, his gaze meeting hers at last. "Then let them call it what they will. Music does not belong to palaces. It belongs to the soul." For a moment, the world stilled. Only the moonlight, only the faint sound of the fountain beyond the wall, only the storm inside two hearts who had crossed a line neither could retreat from. And in that single word, heavy with all that was forbidden, she gave herself away. The days that followed were veiled in peril. Though the East Salon remained their sanctuary, the walls of the palace grew sharper, hungrier, as though listening for secrets. Yasmin and Farid spoke little of what bound them, but each night their silence deepened into something more dangerous than words. His music carried her heart, and her gaze, lingering too long, carried his. But not all eyes were blind. Sheikh Tariq, ever watchful, noticed the change in Yasmin. Her defiance in council, her distraction in Khalid's presence, the faint glow in her eyes that no pearls could explain. He summoned Khalid to his private majlis, where smoke of oud thickened the air and the lamps burned low. Tariq asked, his tone cold. Khalid's jaw tightened. "She resists me, and I know why." Tariq's eyes narrowed, gleaming like a hawk's in the dark. "Farid." "Yes, the boy has bewitched her with his melodies." Khalid slammed his fist against the carpet. "Then we cut out the weakness, expose him, humiliate him." A cruel smile curved Tariq's lips. "Patience, nephew. To strike too soon is to miss the kill. We will watch, gather proof. When the moment comes, we shall reveal him before all, and she will have no choice but to renounce him." That same night, Yasmin sat in the East Salon once more, her emerald cloak draped carelessly across the bench, as though she no longer cared for appearances. Farid's music filled the room with firelight and shadows, every note daring the walls themselves to bear witness. She closed her eyes, her voice soft. "They are pressing me, Farid." Tariq grows restless, and Khalid's hand is already closing around the court. Soon they will announce the marriage publicly. If I resist, I risk disgrace. Farid's hands did not falter. His chords grew stronger, fierce, defiant, as if to shield her with sound. "Then resist," he said simply. Her throat tightened. She turned to him, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. "Do you not understand what you risk? They could cast you out, ruin you, perhaps even take your life." Farid finally lifted his gaze, steady and unflinching. "If music has taught me anything, Sheikha, it is that life is not measured in length, but in truth." The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Yasmin's lips parted, but words failed her. In that gaze, she saw no ambition, no hunger for power, only a man who had chosen to stand in fire with her, though he had every reason to flee. She rose suddenly, turning away, her cloak sweeping across the marble like a storm. At the doorway she paused, her voice breaking. "Do not come tomorrow night." Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the silence. Farid sat at the piano, his fingers still trembling on the keys. He knew what she did not say, that her command was not protection for him, but for herself, that in trying to banish him, she was trying to banish her own heart. But love, like music, once awakened, could not be buried again. And in the shadows of the palace, Tariq and Khalid sharpened their knives of suspicion, waiting for the moment when truth would be revealed not as song, but as scandal. The following days weighed on Yasmin like chains of gold. She obeyed her own command. She did not summon Farid. The East Salon stood silent, its piano covered once more by a silk cloth, as though hiding a truth too dangerous to breathe. Courtiers noticed her renewed discipline and whispered approvingly. Tariq, watching carefully, allowed himself a smile of satisfaction. Yet inside, Yasmin was unraveling. She sat in council chambers listening to petitions, her emerald cloak heavy on her shoulders, but her mind wandered to the memory of moonlight on ivory keys. She stood in the majlis beside Khalid, enduring his endless boasts of trade and conquest, but her ears rang only with melodies that haunted her like ghosts. At night, she lay in her chamber, unable to sleep, the silence pressing so hard against her chest that it ached. Meanwhile, Farid moved through the palace like a shadow dimmed. He polished brass lamps, swept marble floors, carried trays of dates and coffee, all with the quiet dignity that had always marked him. But the servants whispered louder now, emboldened by his absence from the Sheikah's side. "See, it was nothing but a phase," one muttered. "She grows tired of him, as queens always do of their playthings," another sneered. But there were some who spoke with awe. "No, she fears her own heart." Farid bore it all with silence. Yet in his heart, he carried the weight of absence heavier than chains. He had obeyed her words, but every evening when the lanterns were lit, his hands itched for the piano. On the fourth night, unable to endure longer, Yasmin slipped once more into the East Salon. She told herself she came only to sit in silence, to confront the emptiness and prove to herself that she was strong. But when she lifted the silk cover and saw the piano waiting, the restraint in her heart shattered. She pressed a single note, hesitant, clumsy, and it rang hollow in the chamber. A voice broke the silence. She turned sharply. Farid stood at the doorway, half in shadow, as though the palace itself had led him there. "You disobeyed me," she said, her voice trembling between anger and relief. He bowed, his eyes steady. "I obeyed the truth, Sheikah." He gestured to the piano. Yasmin's breath faltered. For a long moment, they stared at one another across the moonlit floor, the weight of duty battling the pull of desire. Farid crossed the chamber, his steps measured, reverent. He sat, laid his hands upon the keys, and let the music rise, soft at first, then swelling into a melody that trembled with longing and defiance. Yasmin closed her eyes, tears slipping free despite her will. "You undo me," she murmured. Farid did not look up, but his voice carried between the notes. "No, Sheikah." Outside the salon, shadows stirred. A servant lingered near the doorway, eyes wide, ears eager. He slipped away into the corridors, the seed of scandal already in his hands, ready to carry it to those who would use it. And so, while Yasmin and Farid surrendered to the music that bound them, their secret began to escape into the veins of the palace, unstoppable, inevitable. The whisper spread like fire across dry desert grass. By the next morning, the rumor had reached Tariq. He received it with the calm of a man who had expected no less. Alone in his chamber, he paced before the carved window, his hands clasped behind his back. The faint call to prayer drifted from the city beyond the palace walls, yet his thoughts were fixed not on God, but on power. "So it begins," he murmured. He summoned Khalid, who arrived brimming with anger. "The insult cannot be ignored," Khalid seethed. "She humiliates me before the court. To be cast aside for a mere servant." Tariq raised a hand, his expression measured. "Patience. Anger is a blunt sword. We must use a dagger, silent, precise, undeniable. The court must see her shame with their own eyes." Khalid leaned forward, hungry. Tariq's smile was like a crescent blade, by setting the stage where truth cannot hide. That night, Yasmin once again stole into the East Salon. The room had become her only refuge, the place where she could cast aside the suffocating role of Sheikah and breathe as herself. Farid was already there, as if the very walls had called him. "You should not come," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "And yet you are here," he replied softly. She sank onto the bench beside him, closer than ever before. "The walls close in around me, Farid. Tariq pushes. Khalid waits like a jackal. They will not rest until I am bound to him. And I—" Her words faltered. Farid's music rose in answer, a melody fierce as desert winds, trembling with defiance. His voice carried through it. "Then fight with this, not with swords, not with decrees, with truth." Yasmin turned toward him, her eyes wet, her lips trembling. His hands did not falter on the keys. The intensity between them thickened, palpable, dangerous. Yasmin's hand, almost without thought, brushed against his as it moved across the keys. For a heartbeat, time itself stilled. Their eyes locked, hers blazing with fear and longing, his steady, unyielding. It was in that moment, charged and fragile, that the trap was sprung. Unseen, the heavy doors of the salon shifted open. In the shadows of the corridor stood Tariq and Khalid, flanked by two advisors. Their eyes fell upon the scene. The sheikha seated beside a servant at the piano, her hand upon his, her gaze betraying everything. Khalid's face twisted with triumph and fury. Tariq's smile returned cold and lethal. "At last," he whispered. Yasmin and Farid, lost in the storm of music and silence, did not yet know that the walls themselves had betrayed them. The next morning, the palace awoke, not to the usual hum of fountains and courtiers' murmurs, but to the clang of summons. Drums rolled in the courtyards, calling ministers, elders, and emissaries to the grand majlis. The atmosphere was thick, charged, as though the air itself anticipated judgment. Farid, unaware of what had been seen, was seized from his duties by two guards. They offered no explanation, only iron grips on his arms and a silence that chilled him. He was led through corridors he had polished with his own hands, now treated not as servant, but as prisoner. Meanwhile, Yasmin was summoned by Tariq himself. He stood at her chamber door, his expression carved from stone. "Niece," he said with calm finality, "your defiance has become a wound upon this house. Today, before the court, truth will be spoken." Her breath caught, but she lifted her chin. Tariq's eyes narrowed. "The truth we saw with our own eyes. You, hand in hand with a servant, your dignity cast aside." Yasmin's chest burned. For a moment fear seized her, but beneath it, deeper, stronger, was the echo of Farid's music. Better to fall free than to rise in chains. She met Tariq's gaze with fire. The Majlis chamber blazed with lanterns, its marble floor polished like water, its mosaics gleaming with lapis and gold. The court assembled in rows, murmuring with anticipation. At the center sat Khalid, resplendent in a robe of sapphire silk, his face triumphant. Beside him stood Tariq, his authority filling the room like a storm. At the far end, Farid was brought in. He walked with quiet dignity despite the guards at his side, his plain thobe a stark contrast to the jewels glittering around him. Yet it was his composure, not his clothing, that drew every eye. He did not bow his head like a guilty man. He stood straight, unflinching. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Yasmin entered then, her emerald cloak sweeping behind her, her face serene though her heart thundered. She walked the length of the chamber like a queen, though chains of expectation sought to drag her down. Tariq stepped forward. "Behold the shame," he declared. "Your sheikha, ensnared by the charms of a servant, her judgment clouded, her duty abandoned. Last night, with these eyes, I saw her hand upon his as he played. Intimacy where there should be distance, weakness where there should be strength." All eyes turned to Yasmin. The weight of generations bore down upon her, the duty to her house, the honor of her blood, the law of tradition. Khalid's smirk dared her to deny it, dared her to bend. She inhaled slowly, her gaze sweeping the court before settling on Farid. His eyes met hers, calm, steady, filled with the truth she had tried to hide. In that moment, her decision crystallized. She lifted her chin and spoke, her voice carrying clear as crystal through the chamber. "I will not deny what you saw. Yes, I sat beside him. Yes, I let his music reach me." The majlis erupted in shocked cries. Tariq's face darkened with fury. Khalid leapt to his feet. He shouted, but Yasmin raised her hand, silencing them. Her eyes blazed. "You call it disgrace. I call it humanity. I will not bind myself to a man I do not respect, no matter what crown he offers. I will not silence the truth that has awakened me. If that costs me your approval, so be it." The chamber was stunned into silence. For the first time, Yasmin's defiance was not whispered in secret corridors, but proclaimed before the world. Farid bowed his head, not in shame, but in reverence, and Tariq, pale with rage, realized that the battle he had plotted in shadows had just erupted into open war. The Majlis chamber erupted like a storm unleashed. Voices clashed, overlapping in outrage and disbelief. Ministers shouted of disgrace, elders of broken tradition, advisors of political ruin. The sound rose like 1,000 falcons shrieking above the desert. Cried one. "A servant touching the Sheikah," shouted another. Tariq raised his hand, and the chaos stilled, though fury still vibrated in the air. His voice, cold as steel, cut through the chamber. "Then let it be decided. This Farid, who dares defile the sanctity of our house, must be punished." Khalid seized the moment, his voice booming. "Banish him to the desert. Strip him of name and shelter." Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but many nodded in agreement. Tradition demanded blood or exile when honor was stained. The weight of centuries pressed against Farid, whose only crime was music. Yasmin stepped forward, emerald cloak blazing like a banner of defiance. Her voice rang out, clear and fierce. The court froze. Tariq turned to her, his expression thunderous. "Do you challenge the Majlis, niece?" "I challenge nothing but your blindness," she answered, her eyes aflame. "This man is guilty of no crime. His only act was to reveal what you fear most. That truth cannot be silenced. You speak of honor, yet you twist it into a chain." The chamber erupted again, half in outrage, half in astonishment at her boldness. Khalid's face burned with fury. "You defend him because you love him," he spat. The words, spoken aloud in the Majlis, struck like lightning. All eyes turned back to Yasmin. For a heartbeat, silence held the chamber in a chokehold. Then Yasmin, with a steadiness that made even her enemies tremble, spoke. Yes, the declaration shattered every pretense, every whisper. It was no longer rumor, no longer suspicion. It was truth, proclaimed before the entire court. Tariq's voice roared above the chaos. "Then you are unfit to rule. A sheikah who binds her heart to a servant disgraces her bloodline, her people, her very throne." 2 guards stepped toward Farid. He did not resist. His eyes remained on Yasmin, calm, even in the face of doom. But Yasmin surged forward, placing herself between him and the guards, her cloak flaring like the wings of a falcon. "Touch him, and you touch me," she declared. The Majlis froze once more, torn between tradition and the terrifying strength of her defiance. Tariq's face twisted with rage, but even he hesitated. To harm her in front of the court would risk rebellion. To allow her defiance to stand would undermine centuries of power. The chamber had become a battlefield, and every word now carried the weight of kingdoms. Farid, standing behind her, whispered softly, so only she could hear, her hand clenched at her side. "Then let it destroy me." The storm had broken, and there would be no returning to silence. The Majlis chamber trembled under the weight of Yasmin's defiance. Never in living memory had a sheikah stood before the council and spoken so brazenly against the chains of tradition. The air was thick with incense and outrage, with fear and fascination. Tariq, though shaken, was quick to recover. His voice thundered, carrying the authority of decades. "You see with your own eyes, council. The sheikah admits not only shame but love for a servant. Such a confession is poison to the honor of our house." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Elders shifted uneasily, torn between tradition and the fire in Yasmin's voice. Khalid seized the moment, his face flushed with triumph. "Then let it be settled. Strip her of authority until she remembers her duty. Remove this Farid from her sight forever." Yasmin's heart hammered, but she did not falter. She turned to the court, her eyes fierce, her voice ringing like a bell of truth. "You fear a servant because he plays the piano. You tremble because a melody reached my heart." Murmurs swelled. Shock, admiration, disapproval, all woven together into a storm. Tariq raised his hand, silencing them. His gaze burned into Yasmin. "Do not mistake passion for power. You have stood where queens stood before you. Women who preserved our house with sacrifice, you spit on their memory. Amid the chaos, Farid remained silent, his presence a calm center in the storm. His eyes never left Yasmin, though he knew his fate was being weighed like grain on a scale. At last, Tariq struck the floor with his staff. The chamber fell into uneasy quiet. His voice was iron. Enough. The Majlis will decide. But until that decision is sealed, the servant will be held in confinement. 2 guards moved forward once more, their hands ready to seize Farid. Yasmin stepped in front of him, her emerald cloak blazing under the lantern light. Her voice cut the air like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Tariq faltered, his eyes narrowing, his mind calculating. To imprison her openly would spark unrest. To let her stand unchallenged would invite rebellion. Khalid, seizing the moment, sneered. Then, let her be stripped of her title. The court buzzed, ministers and elders arguing in hushed tones, the very foundation of the house trembling. Farid, at last, broke his silence. His voice was calm, low, but it carried. If my presence threatens the Sheikah's crown, then take me, but do not strip her of what is hers. Yasmin turned to him sharply, her eyes burning with betrayal and anguish. Do not speak as though your life is nothing, she whispered fiercely. He met her gaze, steady as stone. It is not nothing. It is music. Her heart shattered at his words, and Tariq, seeing the fracture, smiled. Take him, he commanded. The guards seized Farid. Yasmin's cry echoed through the chamber, a sound that silenced even the most hardened of courtiers. And as Farid was dragged from the Majlis, his head high, his eyes steady, Yasmin felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The war for truth had entered its darkest hour. The palace dungeons lay beneath the marble floors, where lantern light seldom reached, and the air carried the damp chill of stone. It was there that Farid was taken, bound not with chains of iron, but with walls meant to erase him from the world above. His thobe was dusted with grit, his hands still raw from resisting the guard's grip. Yet his eyes, steady and unwavering, betrayed no fear. For him, fear was wasted on silence. He had lived his life in the margins of power. The dungeon was no darker than the years he had already endured. What gave him strength was not hope of escape, but the memory of Yasmin's voice in the Majlis, fierce as fire. If you take him, then take me as well. Above, the palace seethed. Rumors surged through corridors, carried by servants and courtiers alike. Some whispered that Yasmin had lost her reason. Others spoke in awe of her courage. Still others feared Tariq's wrath, knowing he would not let this rebellion pass unanswered. Yasmin herself walked the halls like a flame caged in glass. She attended council as required, her cloak draped heavy across her shoulders, but her spirit was restless. Each time she looked at Tariq, her uncle met her gaze with a smile sharpened by triumph. Each time she saw Khalid, his eyes burned with the arrogance of a man certain of victory. Yet at night, when she returned to her chamber, Yasmin shed the mask. She pressed her hand against the lattice window, staring into the desert's dark expanse, and in the silence, she whispered his name. Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal though fearful, begged her to yield. Sheikah, the council murmurs. Tariq's grip tightens. If you resist, they will strip you of your crown. Still, even she felt the weight of despair. For the first time, she doubted whether even her defiance could save him. Tariq was patient, Khalid relentless, the court divided. Every step she took seemed to tighten the noose around them both. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Farid was not left in peace. Tariq descended one evening, his footsteps echoing on the stone, the smell of oud clinging to his robes even in the damp air. He stood before the servant whose music had dared to rival his power. You think yourself noble, Tariq said softly, almost with amusement, but you are nothing. A servant who touched what is forbidden. A sparrow daring to claim the sky of falcons. Farid met his gaze without flinching. Tariq's smile faded. For a long moment, silence stretched, broken only by the dripping of water. At last, Tariq turned away, his voice cold. Then sing while you can. When he was gone, Farid sat against the wall, his body weary, but his spirit unbroken. In his mind, he replayed every note he had ever given Yasmin, every chord that had passed between them. He knew that even if the dungeon silenced his hands, the music lived within her, and as long as it lived within her, he was not defeated. Above, Yasmin lay awake beneath her canopy, her heart a battlefield. She knew Tariq would not wait long. Soon he would press the council to declare Farid's punishment, exile, perhaps death. The thought tore through her like a blade. Yet as the moonlight spilled across her chamber floor, Yasmin felt resolve harden within her. If Tariq sought to destroy Farid, he would have to destroy her too. And if the court demanded her silence, she would answer them not with obedience, but with a storm. The council chamber gathered once more, heavy with tension. Incense burned thick in the air, though it could not mask the scent of fear. Every elder, every minister, every ally of the house knew that the matter had reached its breaking point. No more whispers, no more delays. The fate of Farid and of Yasmin herself would be decided. Tariq presided like a judge carved from stone. His staff struck the marble floor. The time for indulgence has ended. This servant, who dared to taint the Sheikha with his presence, must face justice. A murmur surged through the chamber, some in agreement, others in shock at the severity. Khalid's voice cut through, smooth and commanding. Exile will not suffice. As long as he breathes, he remains a stain, a reminder of shame. Yasmin rose before the court, her emerald cloak trailing like a banner of war. Her voice rang clear, a blade of truth against their thunder. You speak of cleansing, but you mean control. You fear not shame, but the truth he embodies. The council erupted again, outrage, disbelief, and murmurs of awe. One elder rose, his beard white as desert salt. Perhaps the Sheikha speaks truth. Another minister snarled in reply. Love does not crown rulers. Discipline does. The chamber teetered on the edge of chaos. Tariq's staff struck the floor once more, silencing the storm. His eyes blazed with fury. Enough! This is no council of poets. This is a house of law. Yasmin stepped forward, her face radiant with fire. Then take my blood with his. The room gasped. Ministers shifted, elders whispered, some horrified, some awed. Khalid leapt to his feet, rage twisting his features. You would throw away your throne for him? Her gaze cut to him like a blade. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every word was now a spark, and the chamber itself was dry kindling. Tariq's fury could not be contained. Then you are no Sheikha. You are no ruler. You are nothing but a reckless girl undone by desire. The words fell like thunder. Farid, dragged into the chamber in chains, lifted his head. His eyes met Yasmin's across the sea of courtiers. He did not speak, but the calm in his gaze told her everything. I am not afraid. Do not fear for me. Her chest tightened, but her voice rose once more, trembling not with weakness, but with power. If you spill his blood, you will not cleanse this house. You will stain it forever. You will not silence me. You will awaken me. The chamber froze. The words were not just defiance. They were prophecy. And even Tariq, in his fury, felt the tremor of fear beneath them. The battle had reached its peak. All that remained was the final blow. The chamber was a battlefield of silence, every gaze fixed on Yasmin and the man she had sworn to protect. Guards stood poised, their blades gleaming beneath the lantern light, waiting only for Tariq's command. The Sheikha's emerald cloak fanned across the marble like a banner of rebellion. Tariq raised his staff, his voice like thunder. So be it. Let the servant's blood cleanse this shame. The guards moved forward. Yasmin stepped between them and Farid, her voice cutting the air like steel. Gasps tore through the majlis. The council wavered, horror etched on their faces. To strike her, the Sheikha, before the eyes of the elders and ministers, was unthinkable. Yet to disobey Tariq was unthinkable too. For a heartbeat the world hung suspended. Then Yasmin turned, facing the court, not with the fragility of a woman in chains, but with the majesty of a queen awakened. Her voice rose, steady and fierce, filling every corner of the chamber. You call this honor? To slaughter an innocent? You call this strength? To break a man who held nothing but truth? No, this is not strength. The council erupted with murmurs, some voices trembling with doubt. Yasmin pressed on, her words sharp as arrows. If you kill him, you do not silence me. You ignite me, and I will not fall silent, not in chains, not in exile, not in death. Her hand reached for Farid's, clasping it before the entire assembly. The gesture was simple, but its power struck like lightning. The court gasped, ministers shifting uneasily, elders whispering prayers. Khalid surged forward, rage consuming him. You shame us all! Her gaze met his, unwavering. "I choose truth." The Majlis descended into chaos, shouts of outrage, cries of support, the clash of voices echoing like thunder in the vaulted hall. Tariq's staff struck the floor again and again, but the storm could not be contained. For the first time, the authority of his hand wavered. Farid, still bound, turned to Yasmin. His voice was low, yet it carried. Her grip tightened on his hand. The silence that followed was absolute. Tariq's fury blazed, but he saw the council divided, their loyalty shaken. To kill Farid now, with Yasmin standing before him, would risk rebellion within his own walls. To yield would mean surrendering power to her defiance. The stalemate hung heavy, unresolved, a sword balanced on a breath. And in that moment, Yasmin lifted her chin, her voice softer but filled with unshakable strength. "One day, this house will remember that truth is stronger than fear, that love is not weakness, but the fire that keeps kingdoms alive." The words lingered, echoing against marble and mosaic, against falcon banners and golden lanterns. The court had no answer, only silence, a silence more powerful than decree. And so the story did not end with death, nor with surrender, but with a storm left raging, a love unbowed, and a truth spoken aloud before the world. Farid stood in chains, Yasmin stood in defiance, and the palace itself seemed to tremble, knowing that nothing would ever be the same.